Okay, I think we will start now. Good morning, everybody, and welcome all of you to this very important discussion about conflict sensitivity in World Bank operation. I think that will be a great session for many reasons. We first have, I think, a very distinguished panel. I know that is something that is said every time at many presentations, but certainly you will agree with me after listening from my far left to Matt Stephens, who is our senior social development specialist based in a Manila office. Matt is a team leader for a trust fund that deals with peace building at Mindanao. At the same time, he is also responsible for the agenda around peace building and reconstruction recovery in the Philippines. Next to Matt is Holly Benner, and she is a senior social development specialist working on Ukraine. You know the situation in Ukraine, and Holly has been helping the Ukraine team in making sure that indeed a conflict is mainstream across the portfolio. And to my right is Nicholas Mint, senior social development specialist, who is in charge of he is the TTL, tax team leader for the National Community-Driven Development Project in Myanmar. At the same time, he's also leading our task there around conflict and peace. So a great panel. And certainly, I can see in the room also many colleagues from outside the bank and inside the bank who have been working on issues related to conflict and development. So it is great to have you. And I should say that nothing is perfect. So you do have your jet lag moderator, me, Abdullah Sek. I'm the country manager in Myanmar. I said jet lag, but thankfully I have my venti soy latte, so I should be fine. What we'll be doing today is to listen first from Matt about how in the Philippines, the World Bank indeed is making sure that our operation, especially the community-driven development project in Philippines, is conflict sensitive. And after Matt, we'll be listening from Holly, actually not from Nick, who will be discussing this issue about how in Myanmar, World Bank is making sure that our portfolio, our operation is conflict sensitive. And we'll end up the session, we end up the presentation with Holly, who will be discussing how we do in Ukraine. Then I think very important, and that is the reason why I mentioned earlier that we are very glad to have all of you who joined, accepted our invitation. We'll be listening from you, and many of the friends I recognized this morning, and having a question and answer sessions. Maybe half of this session will be about listening from you, answering your questions, and I will conclude around noon, which is basically the 1 hour slot we have today. It's 1 hour. We shall try to make it the best of this 1 hour. I think I will, without further ado, then ask Matt to discuss about the way in Philippines the bank is making sure that in the community-driven development project that we are financing there is conflict sensitive. Matt has joined the bank from the Australian Corporation. Before joining the bank and working for Australian Corporation, he was based in Jakarta. He knows very well the East Asia region. He joined the bank working in our portfolio in Philippines, leading all the discussion around peace and development. And he is a TTL, a task team leader, as mentioned earlier, for the trust fund that deals with supporting this agenda in Mindanao. At the same time, also, he will be discussing today about the community-driven development project in Philippines. So, Matt, to you.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you. I think that was 2 introductions I got today. Please excuse my voice. After years of living in Jakarta and Delhi and Manila, I'm clearly allergic to clean air. But can everyone hear me, including at the back? Okay, we have some nods. So the topic is conflict sensitivity in bank operations. What I'm going to talk, I'm going to try to be about 5 or 6 minutes today, is about an effort that we've undertaken together with government in the Philippines to try to make a large national community-driven development program operate more effectively in conflict-affected areas. I think many of you would be familiar with what CDD is, but basically it takes communities, it organizes communities, it puts them in charge of defining their development problems, they identify solutions, then it gives them money to implement projects at the community level. It usually looks like school classrooms, healthcare centers, daycare centers, small roads. It carries the promise of building social cohesion because it brings different groups together and operates effectively in many, many different conflict-affected areas, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with or have engaged with or even working on such projects. But we see, increasingly evidence suggesting that, in fact, CDD projects don't generate a lot of evidence of impact on social cohesion. Even though when you're out in the field, it looks like they are. The evidence that we're generating, the rigorous evidence that we're generating, suggests that there are very few impacts on social cohesion, despite the fact that you are bringing different groups, sometimes conflicting groups, together through these programs. So against that background, kind of looking at how this can play out with the national CDD program in the Philippines, we've been going through a process over the last couple of years working with the government, that's the Department of Social Welfare and Development, and the Office of the Peace, the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process, which is the key agency for conflict or the peace process in the Philippines, to come up with what they're calling a peace lens. It started off being called a conflict sensitivity window, but part of being conflict sensitive is that people don't like the word conflict. So over time it became known as the peace lens, which is a special set of guidelines for how this program operates in conflict-affected parts of the country. So the next couple of minutes, what I'm going to quickly run you through is a quick overview on different types of conflict in the Philippines, for those who aren't familiar. About 30 seconds on this project, where it operates in conflict-affected areas, the process we went through with the government in preparing that peace lens, what are the main features, so what does it look like, and then where this is going to be taken in the future. So conflict in the Philippines, there's a few people in the room who know this much better than I. So most people, I think, are familiar with the presence of Muslim insurgent groups, Moro Islamic Liberation Front, Moro National Liberation Front, other groups like Abu Sayyaf. There's also a less known but has fairly significant nuisance value, a communist rebellion operating in different parts of the country. And perhaps more damaging in many respects is communal types of conflict, political contestation, natural resource contestation. I think the main conflict areas, I don't have a little pointer thing. So here in the southern part of Mindanao, with the Muslim insurgent groups, here in the northwest of Mindanao, we have a strong presence of the communist rebellion. Some communist groups active here in eastern Visayas, a little bit up here in northern Luzon. But mainly here, and here is where you find the greatest forms of conflict. Now, the Kalai SID's national CDD program has been running since 2002. It covers about half the country, so it's operating in not all, but in many of those locations. It targets at the municipal level, so it's the next level up above the village, based on poverty and disaster criteria. Villages compete for funds. They call it prioritization, not competition, but you have to compete. And that becomes an issue for conflict-affected villages, and I'll come to that. You can see there on the screen what it mostly supports, and I talked about that already. So there's quite a lot of experience through that program that was emerging on how it functions in conflict areas. At the same time, the present government has been significantly expanding investment of development resources in conflict areas. So there's a lot of experience bubbling up from the field through the government. They were using this program in many cases to channel money down to conflict areas. Whether that's an effective approach is a question mark, but there's a lot of experience coming up from the ground about the concerns about whether this was working, were they following the right approaches, and also some issues over security that were coming up through the implementing agency staff. So some of these questions that were asked, that were what the kind of problem that we're hoping to answer through this so-called peace lens, is one is on targeting. As I said, it's a competitive process. It looks at the quality of the proposal, looks at the cost efficiency of the proposal. We know in conflict-affected areas it's harder to get people together. You may have lower capacity, they may be more remote. The cost of implementing a road may be higher there than in non-conflict affected. So there's a feeling that in this competitive process, conflict-affected areas were missing out. Facilitation. You go into a normal village, not that hard to bring the community together. You go into a conflict-affected area where you might have communities fighting, you may have a presence of armed groups. How does a facilitator, maybe fresh out of university, how do they deal with a situation like that? You've got New People's Army with guns operating in that village. How do you deal with that situation? Harder to bring people together, as I said, lack of trust in government, social cohesion. So really, questions are being asked. There was a strong desire for the program to make a contribution to supporting peace at the community level, but questions are being asked, are we working in conflict areas or are we working on conflict? Is there something more the program can do to begin to directly address some of these drivers of conflict while still delivering the basic services that poor communities needed? The final question was on monitoring. Okay, if we are working in these areas, and there's been some research suggested that this program actually increases conflict, at least in the short term. How do we know that? Is it making things worse? Is it making things better? Is it neutral? We didn't have solid monitoring framework to be able to measure those impacts. How are we doing for time? Right, good. So, came up with the idea with government on preparing this peace lens. So step one, we're working with our government counterparts. We went out and looked at a bunch of different places. You saw earlier on the map. We spoke with field staff. We spoke with regional government officials. We spoke with civil society organisations. We spoke with donors working in those areas. Try to better understand some of the dynamics, how the program is operating, issues and concerns, particularly of the project staff. Then we had a kind of endless series of workshops. If you worked in the Philippines, you would know they love workshops. So we did a lot of workshops. At times I was like, man, there's a lot of workshops. But I think the good thing is through this process that it really did come up from the field staff, not just senior officials, but community facilitators, municipal level officials who were involved in facing these challenges on the ground, were heavily involved in putting these guidelines together. So this special set of procedures was drafted and it was fully integrated into it's a 4-step process now for the project. So it doesn't operate outside that, which I think is really crucial, or kind of operational point, but it's fully integrated within the standard cycle. And I think we learned from experience in Indonesia a few years ago. We tried to kind of convert a CDD project into a conflict area project. And we put all these bells and whistles and made it very, very complicated, and they never did any of that. They just ended up doing a plain CDD project. So we really wanted to try to keep this simple and doable, but hopefully still have some kind of impact. So a large kind of set of guidelines, is about 70 pages, was prepared, which is about one for every workshop that we had. But then they turned that into what they call a popularised version of the guidelines that could be used by field workers. So what does it look like? I don't think it's revolutionary. First is there's a set of procedures on how you trigger these guidelines. So what is a conflict-affected area? Largely self-identification, or there's also a government list. Field capacity building, so additional training for the facilitators, so they're more confident going into conflict-affected areas, both on conflict analysis, on conflict management. I don't know if you can see that too well. You're at the social preparation stage, which is when communities are being facilitated to analyse development problems. There's a conflict analysis tool in there, so they can begin to better understand what are the dividers and connectors within their community. In the criteria setting, I mentioned that there's a competition for funds. So the criteria setting, when these guidelines are triggered, gives priority to areas that are affected by conflict so they don't miss out in a competitive process. Key one is sub-project identification, and then there has to be a link between the analysis of conflict drivers and what the sub-project investment is. Now, that can still be a road or a classroom, but maybe it's something like support for resolution of land conflict, maybe it's capacity building for local dispute resolution mechanisms, different options. They get a little more time. There's also special protocols for staff security. That's what the manual looks like. You can read it. I'm running out of time. They've just launched that manual a couple of weeks ago. So our next step is for that to be implemented. They'll be monitoring through the course of this year and next year, and I guess that'll be hopefully the topic of a presentation. They'll get me an invitation to come back next year. So some of the questions are up there that we'll be asking that looks at what we're hoping to achieve out of this. I hope that's been interesting to run through that process, and I look forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matt. I think this idea of yes, yeah, you can. This peace lens manual, I think, is very important. I think initiative. The first time I read from Matt was when he did peer review the National Community-Driven Development Project in Myanmar. And that is a project that Nick here is leading. So it is a good transition, I think, for Nick to come and discuss how in Myanmar World Bank is indeed making an effort to ensure that the portfolio is conflict sensitive. Nick joined us in 2009 from the UN, where he spent about 7 years working on the issue of governance and peace. He joined the bank in 2009 to work on the WDR. He was one of the core team members of the WDR. Then moved on to Myanmar. At the time, we were re-engaging there in 2012. So he led this effort around the interim strategy note and also the country partnership framework. So very happy to have Nick here and see how we are doing in Myanmar on these issues of conflict sensitivity and portfolio. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Abdullah. Let me bring up the presentation. Thank you for that very kind introduction as well. And thank you all for coming. The room is pretty full now. We've got still seats here in the front if anyone wants to move up. I want to talk a little bit about both the overall efforts we're making to integrate conflict sensitivity in the Myanmar portfolio, and then speak a little bit, drill down, as it were, on one particular project, which happens to be the CDD project. So you're hearing twice now about different CDD projects. That means I can save a little time introducing the project. Now, briefly on the context, I mean, there's a long history of armed conflict in Myanmar, dating back really to the first days of post-colonial independence. Myanmar is a highly diverse, ethnically diverse country with many ethnic minorities sort of clustered around this mountainous horseshoe periphery of the country. So if you're looking, here mainly you've got the sort of Bama heartland, which is flat, rice-growing areas, and then here you've got the mountains with many different ethnic minorities. Many of whom took up arms against the government very early on over issues related to their own recognition as cultural groups, right of speaking their own languages, self-governance, resource sharing, and others. The conflict with the Karen and the Karen National Union was the world's longest-running civil conflict until a ceasefire was reached in 2012. So it's you see here, just in terms of the areas affected, it's a big chunk of the country, right? But it's not all of the country. And there have been many big changes in Myanmar over the last couple of years, including the political opening that led to the re-entry of the NLD into politics and their victory in the national elections last year. An NLD government will take office 1 month from now on the 1st of April. There was a major economic transition and an aid transition as well, with organizations like the bank re-engaging. And so it's entirely possible to live in Myanmar, to live in Yangon, work in Naypyidaw, and never really see conflict-affected communities. It's very possible to live a life where you don't worry about this. It is not a country where that is sort of a post-conflict everywhere. You've got burned-out buildings. And in a way, and I mean, there's been some work on subnational conflict, and I know there's another session on that. It makes it possible to ignore that issue. And so I think the very first thing when we talk about conflict sensitivity is actually a willingness to recognize the complexity of conflict and to engage. And so we had this discussion early on in the bank group. I think it's useful, though, to recap why we're engaging, because we do get asked that question. So one, it's where the poor are. It's central to our mission. Conflict-affected communities are among the poorest of the poor in Myanmar. Secondly, it's a key priority for the government. So the government of President Thein Sein launched a peace initiative. The government of Aung San Suu Kyi has announced that they want to govern as a government of national reconciliation with peace as their #1 priority. And so we have a responsibility as development partners in our work to support those priorities. Thirdly, though, in the long run, it does reduce risk. It helps us to build a balanced and well-informed portfolio. So it is also good business for us. But I will get to some of the challenges that complicate that picture. Maybe just to say, in terms of how the bank has responded, we've had very strong management support, including in the country partnership framework, which was the bank's first full country strategy for the country in over 30 years. Conflict was one of the cross-cutting areas where we said this is something that we're going to look at in everything that we do, whether it's our analytical work, whether it's our lending, whether it's on aid coordination. We are going to look at conflict in every one of those dimensions. We've mobilized, through generous support from the Korean Trust Fund for State and Economic Transitions, money to support what we call support to the Myanmar peace process, which has 3 key dimensions, key components. One is on aid effectiveness, one is on building a shared knowledge base, and the third is on conflict sensitivity in our portfolio. And the way that that has played out is basically, on the one hand, a sort of portfolio-wide approach, where we have a monthly risk monitor, where we monitor certain risks on an ongoing basis to keep track of the evolving environment. We've had periodic workshops where we've done a full top-to-bottom portfolio review to see how our portfolio is stacking up against evolving risks, how we can make sure that individual operations are informed by conflict considerations. But we also then, beyond the sort of broad portfolio approach, have had specific support to individual task teams to help them, provide them with resources, whether it's independent consultants, outside expertise, support for engaging with armed groups, to help them integrate conflict sensitivity in their work. But there's a couple of big challenges, and I think it's important when we talk about conflict sensitivity to talk about the challenges and to talk about why this isn't happening everywhere, why this isn't happening consistently. I think the first is that the ethnic armed groups, despite an initial ceasefire agreement that was reached last year that in theory provides space for development activities to go forward, remain highly concerned and sometimes suspicious of the impact of development assistance in their areas, both because they sometimes see it as an expansion of government programs, but also because they have negative experience historically with sort of quote-unquote development in the form often of bulldozers and mines and highly sort of disruptive activities. But thirdly, also because there's a legitimacy issue. Some of these armed groups are actually the primary service providers for populations in their areas. And so, improving a government school or improving a government health center increases potentially the disparity between the services they deliver and what the government delivers. And so it creates tensions in the sense that one of the things that's happened since the ceasefires have taken effect is that you've had people being able to move about more easily, to choose where they seek, for example, access to health services. And that has led to a reduction in demand in some areas for health services provided by the ethnic groups. And for them, that's a key question, is legitimacy. They're incidentally also suspicious sometimes of the bank. We work very closely with government, and we haven't been there in a long time. So it's not as though they see the bank as this phenomenal actor that's going to get this right and solve these problems. Briefly then, task teams can be reluctant. And I'm a TTL of a lending project. I know how this goes, right? You've got lots of pressure to deliver. You've got limited resources, limited time. Dealing with conflict adds complexity. It adds risk. And that, I think, is compounded by the fact that you have very vocal advocacy groups, especially here in the southeast of the country, which shares a long border with Thailand. You've had 50 years of conflict, and you've had 30 years of outside donors supporting advocacy groups as a sort of counterbalance to what used to be a military government, right? These groups continue to exist, and they continue to view very critically engagement in these areas. And that limits the room for maneuver for organizations like the bank, which is highly sensitive to any kind of negative press. And so if you're a TTL, you think about that, right? You think about putting yourself sort of out there on the line, taking on this additional complexity. And I think that really, it factors into how we engage. So the bottom line on this slide, I think, is that you need management support, and we're very lucky to have that in Myanmar. You need resources to engage on these conflict issues, and we're very lucky to have that in Myanmar. But I think, thirdly, you need to create and change the incentives for task teams also. You need to recognize success. You need to have a greater acceptance, I think, of negative press and of risk. And let me maybe just briefly then talk about the community-driven development program, which is a $550 million CDD program, so very similar in terms of the setup as to what Matt has described in the Philippines. Communities get together, they build community-level infrastructure using grants provided through this program. In this case, communities don't have to compete, they're eligible, and the grant size is determined by population. IDA is providing significant support to that project, so we're really right in there with government. We were in with government when we designed this program. And the government has been very consistent that they want to target the poorest townships in the country. And that leads you inevitably into some townships that are affected by armed conflict. So the way we've dealt with that is first by analysis. So as we expand into new townships, the bank and DRD, the Department of Rural Development, which is the implementing agency, have fielded assessment teams that went out to the townships, looked at the situation there, met with stakeholders there, and provided reports that gave some sense of, is it feasible to expand there, and what are the likely problems, to kind of help us get a head start. Then there's been active engagement with the armed groups at both the local and the headquarter level. And again, this is something that requires management support, because the bank is not necessarily an organization comfortable with engaging with ethnic armed groups. And we've had adaptations, operational adaptations in terms of the training provided to project staff, the options for villages to defer grants into outer years. We're discussing right now with the Karen National Union the idea of civil society monitoring the project through a third-party monitoring mechanism. I think we've had significant achievements on this. So we've had effective operations in the face of active conflict. One of these townships, Namsan, which is right here, has been in the project for 3 years in an area where armed conflict has spiked in the last 18 months. And none of our sub-projects have been damaged, none of our staff have been harmed, because the facilitators all come from that township, and there's very active ongoing discussions with the armed groups active there. We've had promising engagement with the KNU on the expansion, especially here in the southeast. And I think in that process, we're creating, I think, a good precedent for how government programs can engage with ethnic groups in a way that's different from how things were done in the past. But I come back to the challenges. There remains very strong suspicion by some of the advocacy groups, by some of the ethnic groups, and I think we have to be just cognizant of that and honest about it, that they are not yet, at least not uniformly across the board, comfortable with this. So there remains a very active need for continuing this dialogue, both by government and by the bank, to build that comfort. And there's suspicion by the donors. I mean, the bank, again, it's not that we have a reputation necessarily of always getting this right, of being nimble, of, being informed by local context, of integrating diversity into our programs. Very briefly, it increases the risk to our program at a critical time, because the new government is taking power. We want to basically, on the government side, showcase a program that's performing well. Nobody wants to have negative voices in the room at that time. So, this is a problem, and it's highly time and resource intensive. So we're talking about conflict-affected areas here and here, sucking up enormous amounts of time and effort. So it would have been safer to stay focused on the Bama heartland, but the government didn't want to do that. They wanted to target the poorest areas. They wanted, including in conflict-affected townships. And I think that's a question for us as we go forward. I think it should be our ambition to be a partner that can help the government deal with complex environments and to deliver and develop solutions to deal with those. I think just in the same way that our financing, for example, in China, is focused primarily on Category A projects where we have highly complex safeguards issues, because they see us as an organization that can deliver in that environment of complexity. I think we ought to build that kind of capacity on the conflict sensitivity side, but I think it requires, again, management support, resources, and a different approach to risk and results. That's it. Sorry.
And we can applaud it. Thanks very much, Nick. I certainly like, Nick, your point about if one visit Yangon or Naypyidaw, you may not see the conflict in Myanmar. So it is extremely important, I think, what the team at the bank has been trying to do in the country to making sure that conflict indeed is taken into account in the development agenda, because it is a very important issue. When talking about Nick and Holly, sometimes I think somewhat like twins, because they all joined the bank at the same time in 2009, and they joined working on the WDR 2009 on conflict security and development. So, but before joining the bank, Holly has worked extensively in many organizations, including the Brookings institutions, where she was assistant director there. She worked for the State Department, she worked for the UNHCR, and at the Carter Center. So it's extremely nice to have you, Holly, and to listen from you about how in Ukraine, under your leadership, we try to make sure that across the portfolio, we do take the issue of conflict sensitivity into consideration. Thanks.
Thanks, Abdoulaye. It's nice to be Nick's twin. I hope not the evil twin. Anyway, I'm going to talk a little bit about the Ukraine approach, and this is kind of going back more towards the macro level. I think this is a more nascent or early approach on the conflict sensitivity, and so I'm going to talk a bit more generally about some of our early approach and some of the lessons and questions we have going forward. Just to say briefly what conflict looks like in Ukraine, we've been using lately a bit of an iceberg metaphor for it. Certainly you've got a lot of very acute crises and political transitions that are happening in the aftermath of the Maidan protests and the outbreak of conflict in the east, but really a lot of that is driven by a series of underlying below-the-surface structural drivers of conflict. So whether this is regional divides between East and West, deep governance challenges and distrust of citizens in the state, and a lot of geopolitical pressures, obviously. And then just thinking through what this means, why does the World Bank, what's the development side of the conflict situation in Ukraine? And we've typically looked at this in two different ways, and this is actually also how we're framing some of our inputs to the systematic country diagnostic that the World Bank is putting together in Ukraine right now. So first, on more the macroeconomic side, certainly the conflict in the east is in an area of the country that has traditionally been the industrial heartland of Ukraine. So there's been huge impacts in terms of disruptions in trade and transport and small and medium enterprise development. And just general job creation. There's impacts across the country in terms of investor confidence. So really a crisis in terms of willingness of foreign direct investment to come in. And then certainly in terms of the Ukraine's own budget, a lot of resources going towards defense spending now and to the response to internally displaced. So just to say there's a bucket of issues on the macroeconomic side in terms of impacting Ukraine's overall development prospects. And then on the microeconomic side, in terms of the impacts on peoples and populations, certainly in eastern Ukraine, there's a huge impact on the livelihoods and opportunities for the populations there. There's about 1.7 million people that have been displaced internally throughout the country. And now increasingly, about 2 years since the outbreak of conflict, you're seeing returning combatants and the impacts on communities across the country as well. But it's also an interesting case and maybe somewhat similar to Myanmar in that you can be in Kiev and feel like there isn't a conflict going on. So, and certainly the Ukrainian political leadership is very much seized with the political and economic reforms and transitions that are going on. So it's hard to get, in some ways, some of the attention on the conflict, though certainly it is having both macro and micro impacts. Now, in terms of our approach, we have a FY16 programmatic approach on peacebuilding and recovery, and it really flows from a recovery and peacebuilding assessment that we carried out with the UN and the EU in 2013 and 14, and a series of knowledge activities on conflict assessment and on the portfolio last fiscal year. And the objective is really to support the governments by promoting peacebuilding, conflict sensitivity, and resilience in development interventions. And the way we set it up, and this was actually at the request of the country management unit, is to have two tracks. One, a much more internally focused track. So how do we mainstream conflict and displacement sensitivity in the bank's own strategy and operations and portfolio, and then a more external facing component, which is very much how do we provide the government just-in-time technical assistance and capacity building support on conflict and recovery issues. And certainly those two tracks are very interrelated, but I think it's a nice way to think about the mainstreaming work more broadly. In terms of the kind of activities that are under each side of those, on the mainstreaming internally, we've been working very closely on the bank's systematic country diagnostic and the country strategy that's being developed this year. So how do you embed this attention to conflict, both the macro and micro sides, into that? We developed a combined governance and conflict filter, which is basically a sort of questionnaire checklist that any bank TTL that's about to initiate an activity is required to go through, and it takes into account some of the considerations on the conflict drivers and how that might impact sectoral programming. And then we're doing quite a bit on the knowledge side, and particularly on the development aspects of internal displacement. On the more external facing side, we've been working very closely in terms of how do we operationalize this recovery and peace building assessment. So the government's actually set up a state agency for Donbass recovery in the East. We've been working very closely with them on training and capacity building. I was there actually last week doing training workshops. We did a couple of large, speaking of workshops, Ukrainians also like workshops, on the conflict and on some of the early recovery issues. They're developing a state target program for recovery, so we're working very closely on that. And then also thinking about ongoing monitoring system and coming up with a design and a way to regularly update this recovery and peace building assessment. The programmatic approach has both bank budget and trust fund resource associated with it, so we're actually also using a state and peace building fund grant to really finance some of this early knowledge and institution building activities. This is just to say that we've tried to mobilize a very diverse team for the programmatic approach that goes across our global practices and is based both in Kiev and here in Washington. And I think that's really important in terms of having the kind of surge capacity you need and the expertise to deliver across the program. And I wanted to mention, because I thought this was a useful thing, and this was recommended in our, when we did the concept review for the programmatic approach. But basically the reviewer said, you know, Ukraine's a very difficult operating environment. There's a lot of risk and uncertainty, also in terms of the political environment. And it's a huge portfolio for the bank, and one that it's just challenging in its own right. So what they said is, why don't you think about doing a SWOT analysis, so a strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats analysis, to really think about where the programmatic approach could make a difference. So we've done that as part of our team building work, and that's really been a guide, and I won't go into the details of what we found, but that's been a really early guide for us in terms of how we've set our priorities for the PA. Some highlights that I think have really influenced our work. There's certainly a lot of issues around the political impetus behind a development approach in Ukraine to the conflict. So we've been really trying to think about using the bank's role as a real trusted partner on development economic issues to really push government and do advocacy in that regard. We also have an interesting maybe weakness/opportunity in Ukraine in that we don't really have a lending anchor. We don't have a project that is explicitly focused on conflict and displacement activities. So I think it's a bit different than the Myanmar, Philippines, where you have these CDD operations that are ongoing, that it's easy to kind of build in this peace or conflict mainstreaming lens. So we've been really thinking hard about how do we approach the more traditional sector teams like transport, district heating, some of the big chunky projects that we have in Ukraine. How do we begin to really focus on them, and what's the value added to them in terms of taking on board some of these conflict and displacement issues? We do have a ton of support from the country management unit and the country director, so that's been, I think, very helpful. And certainly the strong relationship with this new state agency for Donbass recovery will be a real anchor for our technical assistance work going forward. So that SWOT analysis really has led us to focusing on the kind of issues moving forward. Again, the idea of helping the government with the state program for Donbass recovery and the development side of that. There's been, and what we learned last week in our workshop is the real need to think about some sort of innovative financing mechanisms to do some early confidence building on recovery efforts in the East. So we've been exploring the potential for a multi-partner trust fund together with the UN for Ukraine. And also thinking about ways that we could unlock what typically happens with our Ukraine portfolio, the bank's portfolio writ large, is it gets very stuck in the central ministries. So we're trying to think about ways that we could channel resources more towards a local level. We'll continue to think about the design of a monitoring system that could update the recovery and peace building assessment data on a more regular basis. And I think this would be helpful both for the government and for international partners who are coming in with programming and financing. And then we'll continue to make the focus on the systematic country diagnostic and the country strategy. I think these are really the anchors of us being able to influence the bank's work in Ukraine, and also continuing to work closely with some of the sectoral task teams. So I'll stop there, but I had just, in putting this together and listening to Matt and Nick, I think also some just questions and challenges that we've run into in these early days is really what's different about mainstreaming conflict sensitivity when you're working in a middle-income country and where conflict may not be the most prominent issue on the agenda. How do you sell it? We certainly have trouble in Ukraine on access and restrictions on the bank's work in the East. How do you deal with that? And then what are some of the issues around financing and then finally, I think this pitch, what's the pitch to some of the traditional sector colleagues on taking on board some of these considerations when, as we've discussed, maybe it may not, you've got busy task team leaders where this may not be the central point of their agenda. So I'll leave it at that and look forward to the discussion and questions. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Holly. And I think thank you for the presentation, but also for these slides that open very nicely this bridge to this second part of this discussion about question and answers. I think we have had a very fast journey from Manila to Kiev through Naypyidaw. And we have had the chance in that journey to learn from three teams about how indeed we are addressing this issue of conflict sensitivity in World Bank operation. So here we are, and I would like to listen from you now about questions you have for the, I see hands already everywhere. We'll have time, so let's take maybe 2 or 3 questions and then get our panelists to answer, and then we go to another round. Asmin, I think I heard so you. It's not like I'm a right person, but I saw them first, so I will come to you. So Asmin, Usman, 2 of you, okay, and you. I think we don't. Sorry. Because we are recording, so it's important to make sure that other colleagues, friends around the globe will get a chance to hear about this session.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, very well. Thank you.
Okay, so the question is, what's the counterfactual? Do these kinds of approaches really make a difference in results in the portfolio and the implementation of the projects? That's the first one. And the second one, picking up from Holly's point, CDD, wonderful, you have all these approaches to work with the community. How do you deal with a national roads project that is going into conflict areas? How do you convince central government agencies that are doing these kind of large-scale infrastructure projects in sensitive areas that you need to use a different approach? And do we have any examples of projects that have done that?
Thank you very much, Asmin. The second question, that was Usman.
Actually, one of my questions echoes your second question. So I wanted to know, I mean, what's the applicability of this approach beyond CDD projects? Because the examples that we've been given are CDDs. So does the same guideline work just as effectively for other investment types of lending? My second question is, if you're operating in a non-fragile state where fragility is at subnational level, I mean, do you need to actually make the entire portfolio conflict sensitive? I mean, because I'm thinking that maybe it might be more efficient to just tailor the conflict sensitive aspects to those areas where you actually need to address conflict. My third question is, how do you derive an M&E framework, for instance, from this peace building lens? I mean, I'm guessing that, I mean, the lens influences the design of the operation. Now, what's the next step to actually evolving an appropriate monitoring and evaluation framework? What indicators do you use and how do you design them? Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Usman. Two very rich set of questions. I wonder if our panelists would like to answer first these two set of questions, and then we can go to a second round of questions. I think maybe just starting with Matt about the question we heard from Asmin and then from Usman. You can just bring it together and provide answer to some of them, and then I will ask Holly and then Nick to come in.
Yeah, I mean, these are great questions and right on the money, you know, because you put a lot of time and effort into preparing that. Doesn't make any difference. I mean, with the national CDD program, as I said, it's a little early to say, having just started. But I think if we look at our experience with other CDD programs in the really heavily conflict-affected areas, part of our conflict analysis there was understanding that you had to reach out to armed groups, that you had to bring in religious leaders, that you had to understand local dynamics and the necessity for, you know, getting a social license to move into a place in order to operate. So I think, you know, on one level, and this comes a little to Usman's question, the fact that the program can actually deliver at all in a conflict-affected area is one, your immediate and perhaps most important indicator of success. Now, we got a few of the Asia Foundation people in the room in the Contested Corners study looking at subnational conflict a few years ago. When you're traveling down in the southern island provinces of the Philippines trying to find examples of good development programming, quite often the only one they could find was the Armed Social Fund. In the remote places, there was nothing else there because it was the only one that could actually deliver. Now, did it deliver peace-building outcomes? The evidence we have suggests not particularly. Did it build strong trust in state? Not enough. You know, is that a product of poor conflict analysis? Is that a product of maybe lack of time? Maybe they needed 10, 20 years there to have that kind of impact. So I think, you know, for me, the first and most important indicator is actually, can you deliver in a place? Do you not get rejected? Do you not get burned? You know, we've seen that with the National Solidarity Program too in Afghanistan. Much lower chance of being burned by militants. So I think we need to expand. In the M&E framework, we will be looking at indicators like social cohesion, like trust, where we have data looking at conflict incidents. I don't know whether we can realistically expect it to have impact on conflict incidents and intensity, but we will look and we will try to measure that. So I'm going to leave mine at that. I'd like to take up the issue about national agencies and other projects, but perhaps someone else, either Holly or Nick, would want to have a crack at that.
Holly, yes, for instance, about these challenges to mainstreaming this beyond CDD program. I mean, you mentioned that in your presentation. Maybe you can develop more.
Yeah, I wish I had a really good answer to this one, but I think this is sort of the key question. In Ukraine, and I think there's some things that can make it more of an enabling environment for this to happen. So, for example, in Ukraine, there is a sort of CMU country director directive that every team has to go through this conflict and governance filter. Now, I agree very much that I think you want to be selective in how this is applied, and it's best to pick the investments where you think there might be some potential to bring the sensitivity on board. In the Ukraine case, I mean, we are very much at the beginning of this, but there has, for example, in our health program, been some uptake in terms of serving IDP, internally displaced populations, and providing some tailored support in terms of our health program there. But what you're actually seeing quite a lot in Ukraine is that these bigger projects are actually pulling back from conflict-affected areas. So I think the challenge to us is really how do we work with some of these teams and say you can actually continue to implement here, and this is how we're going to support you with that. So I think this is going to be our key challenge going forward, and I think the sell will have to be that you're making it easier rather than more difficult on task team leaders. And I think an important aspect of that is really being on the ground and willing to lend expertise and bring the people that they might need to do this kind of work. There are experiences around the world on the use of these filters in sectoral programming. So Ukraine is certainly one, but Kyrgyz Republic is a more established one that's been happening over the last few years. And I think there are some good lessons in how you embed this in some of the more mainstream sectoral programming. But I think it's a difficult question and one that we will grapple with over the next few months.
Indeed, Holly, thank you very much. Maybe Nick, very quickly, I mean, on this issue of the result. I mean,
yes.
I mean, and somewhat you are also the task team leader for this peace program in Myanmar, and you certainly have a lot of interaction with all task team leaders across the portfolio. Maybe you can share some of the ideas also around this.
Yeah. No, I think, Guzman, it's a great question, right? And it's a little bit selection bias that we're both Matt and I are talking about CDD because it's, of course, the programs we know best from the social family. But I think it's very much applicable beyond CDD programs, right? And I would argue also beyond lending programs. So on the lending side, sure. I mean, for example, in Myanmar, we've got an education program, we've got a health program. And the question of access to services, ability of ethnic minorities to access them, conflict sensitivity in terms of what that does to the legitimacy of the services being provided by the ethnic armed groups, and what the sort of trajectory is towards basically integrating service delivery in the long run. I think these are very relevant questions and arguably more relevant for sectoral programs such as education and health. I think that when we look at some of the analytical and advisory work that we do, so the public expenditure review that we did in Myanmar, for example, has had tremendous uptake among the ethnic armed organizations. I think that there's very few people who get quite as excited about intergovernmental sort of fiscal transfers as organizations that are about to sit down at the negotiating table with government and want to know how does this actually work, what's on the table, what's up for grabs. We're about to embark on a land governance assessment framework, right? Land, critical issue when it comes to conflict. So I think you have very much across the spectrum opportunities for engaging. I think you're right, though, that when it comes, for example, to issues of subnational conflict, we need to manage the burden on the TTL. So I think we need to have a very easy initial way of looking at, what's applicable here, and so that other projects can simply go ahead. I think when it comes to results, I think this is a really critical question because I don't think we have a very good way of measuring results yet, and I think that leads to what Holly's describing, big programs basically pulling back from conflict-affected areas because it increases the complexity and the resources required, and it increases the risk, and it doesn't really do anything on your results framework if you're measuring number of people served or amount of money dispersed or the types of things we tend to measure. And so I think that is a very important question. How do we measure success? I agree with Matt that the fact that we're there, that we have access, that people are supportive of it are important measurements. But I don't think that these are the types of things that are currently being picked up in our results frameworks.
Thank you very much, Nick. And we have a space for 2 more questions. And Thomas, I think you, and then you. Special. Okay.
Thanks, Abdullah. I'm Tom Parks from the Australian Aid Program, DFAT. I wanted to talk about Matt and specifically Nick's point on incentives for TTLs, an excellent point. that there are, there's dilemmas for TTLs in that type of context. I mean, in many ways, looking at Myanmar, the way that you've run the CDD program, looking at the PFM program, there's a lot of good examples of programs calibrating, understanding conflict dynamics, and working in ways that absolutely go, basically doing the best we can to be conflict sensitive in those areas. But it's inconsistent, even within the Myanmar program, right? So as you know, we've talked about before, the education program there is totally on the opposite end of the spectrum. And we've been in a situation where we're trying to work with the bank on that project, but having difficulty with a task team that's just not interested in talking about those issues. So Holly mentioned in Ukraine the necessity of, actually that there's a peace lens or a peace filter. It's actually required of all task teams. And so we're wondering why that's not been applied in Myanmar. Similarly, a question is, what can we do as bilateral donors to help you address these issues more effectively, right? So we've been quite confused and frustrated in terms of how we can be helpful, and we think that there's probably a lot of things we can do better. And the last point is also, just in the Myanmar context, the ADB has a very interesting program, a road through a very, very difficult part of Karen State, which was done in, I mean, there were some problems with it, but it was done in a very, conflict-sensitive way, as much as it could have been, using some very, very good experts on that part of Myanmar. So just a few questions, thanks.
Thank you, and we have Tom also.
Tom Smith too, so yeah, people don't believe me here. So both for the Myanmar experts, I have a quick question. I'm nonprofit focused on government transparency here and abroad. And I loved your insight, Nicholas, about one of your biggest problems being the actual local trust at the bottom, at the lowest level. And so I'm wondering, with the multiple grievances that most likely lead to the mistrust, one of those being public sector corruption, and obviously possibly the link of funds going to the government being misused. How, if and how, did you see that manifest itself while working your project? And was there any measures that you saw effective, non-effective in confronting that? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. If there is one more hand, I'm happy to take. Okay, you got it. Congratulations. So.
Okay, thanks. This is for Nicholas, I suppose, on Myanmar, but it might be applicable elsewhere. I'm putting together a work plan and detailed methodology for a vulnerability assessment with MCAA, MCCA, I guess is the acronym, the Climate Change Initiative. And, so actually, this is related to your last comments, but I'm wondering, I mean, an issue that I'm facing right now, methodological issue, is so this VA, this vulnerability assessment, of course, is related to climate change issues and flooding in particular with the two townships. By the way, one of the two townships is where the saffron revolution started out from a monk uprising after the fuel price subsidy was removed, I think, in 2009. And I looked through the terrific recent QSEM report from the bank, qualitative study. Anyway, so the question really is...
Yes, please.
So that report doesn't address conflict, and I guess, so I'm just wondering, what is generally, I suppose, the government's sensitivity to, since there's a lot of work being done now on climate change issues, where there needs to be this integration for a vulnerability assessment where you have conflict vulnerability assessments and then you have climate change and urban resilience side. So what's the talk about this, I guess?
We got it. Thank you very much. Three good questions. I mean, maybe I will ask this time Nick to start, addressing the issue about how we are consistent, for instance, in Myanmar in enforcing this conflict sensitivity approach, and then maybe get Holly and Matt to chip in on other questions.
Great, thanks, Abdullah. I'll be brief. I don't want to test your patience or your hunger. I think these are excellent questions. Tom, you asked what can bilaterals do to help, and I think it's really important to think about the partnerships here, right? Because we are not a political organization. We lack sometimes the the relationships that bilaterals have with the armed groups. And I think that that's one obvious area where we can work together better to deepen our understanding and the lines of communication into these groups, right? And I think that that's something where we can really benefit from working together. There was a question around corruption, for example, how that's as a root cause of grievances. So the CDD program has a grievance handling mechanism, as do all bank finance projects. But the grievance handling mechanism, when we designed it together with the government in 2012, everybody told us this will never work, won't work. Communities will be too afraid to report grievances to government. What we were able to do was to create a system that guaranteed enough protections and anonymity if people chose, that people have been using it. 1,600 grievances were filed over the last 3 years, and that sounds like a lot of grievances, and some of them have been deeply problematic for me as a TTL, but I think, I fundamentally point to that as a sign of success, that the system is working. And over 90% of those were resolved within 2 weeks to the satisfaction of the original complainants. So I think that there's a lot that has been going right on that. The question of why aren't we applying this more systematically in Myanmar, I think it's something where we have tried to apply it more systematically. It is now something that teams are asked at the concept stage to address. But it is true that the initial early sort of batch of programs went ahead with less of that integrated. And then I think it comes back to sort of the internal incentives and how much can you move the needle on task teams, which is happily Abdullah's job, not mine.
No, I mean, I'm happy to follow up with Tom on this aspect. I mean, clearly there have been bumps, along the way, but we are getting there. But what will be your take, Holly and Matt, on those issues? We discussed the incentive for TTL, the issue of, local trust and corruption.
Maybe just make a couple points. I think on the incentives, and I think on this filter idea, I think it's only as good in a way as you can engage the TTL. So while I appreciate the mandatory nature of it, I actually think it's equally as good to focus in on a couple of operations where you think you have a real opening. So I think it's a sort of whether it's better to have a mandatory checklist or a deep engagement with a couple teams. It could go either way. Try to do both. On the bilateral donors, I mean, just to say on this, I think in Ukraine, which may be the most political place I've ever been involved in, it's so critical in a way for the donors to give us some of the space to do the development side of the work. And that was something certainly in this last week of workshops became very apparent in this advocacy role with government to push for that. And for that space for the bank on the development aspects of the conflict is very important. Maybe I'll leave it at that since Matt.
I mean, I would just add, let's work together on analysis. We need in-depth conflict analysis in a range of different places. You're doing it as you expand with your program. This is something, we've got the resources, we can work together on that. On the incentives, it's found it very difficult, frankly, and the task team leaders tend to respond to what their clients are interested in. And similar to Myanmar or Ukraine and the conflict-affected areas, the national government agencies generally would rather ignore them. And so it hasn't been easy. We've tried to use trust fund money to kind of get them involved and get them interested. But at the end of the day, our approach has not been to have a checklist and make it mandatory, but to try to work on some really major operations like the national CDD, and we want to expand out to a conditional cash transfer program, rural development programs to try to help demonstrate that working like this can make the project more effective. And at the end of the day, that's what the TTLs want, is a better project, more success. And if we come in heavy-handed, then they won't work with us.
Thanks, Matt. I think we came to the end of this session because I think it's very interesting discussion. We could have spent a little bit more time talking about this. But I don't know about the availability of the panelists, maybe having a coffee and asking a very few last round of questions before you leave. For me, I would like really to thank all of you again, for coming to this very important discussion. thank you for your questions. What is quite clear, I mean, for the World Bank, this is an organization that has been set up right after the Second World War. So paying attention to conflict and making sure that conflict is indeed taken into consideration in what we do is extremely important. And I hope that through the 3 presentations we have had, you could get a sense of how teams, I mean, in different contexts, different circumstances, are trying to put this into actions. Clearly, there are a lot more going on in other regions and on other countries, and we look forward to seeing I mean, more of these cases presented in other avenues and other occasions. So thank you very much, all of you, for coming. And let's just give a very big round of applause to our panelists here who did a very good job. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.